Good evening. Wherever you are tonight, let the day fall away for a while and settle in. I want to take you back 700 years to a stretch of land that no longer answers to the names it wore then, in a year when the sky simply refused to stop raining. I have carried this story with me for a long time, and tonight feels like the right night to finally set it down beside you. In the autumn of 1315, across a wide reach of northern Europe, ordinary families are doing the same quiet arithmetic in kitchen after kitchen, weighing the grain that has come in from the fields against the months of winter, still standing ahead of them. And in village after village, the sums are not working out. This is not tonight a story of armies or plague. It is something quieter and in its own way harder to sit with. It is the story of the year the harvest itself failed, and an entire population had to learn together, and mostly alone, what it means when the food simply runs out before the winter does. Picture a woman in a small farming village in the county of Flanders near the low-grey coastline on an afternoon late in October. She kneels beside a wooden grain bin in the corner of her home, the bin that by this point in the year should be nearly full, and she runs her hand along the bottom of it, feeling for grain that is not there. Rain has fallen with almost no real pause since the spring, before soaking the field so thoroughly that the wheat, when it finally ripened, came in thin, pale, and streaked with mould, barely half of what the same field gave the year before. She has already done this reckoning once this week. The answer has not changed. What she is holding in her hands she understands quietly without panic, because panic will not put grain back into an empty bin, is perhaps 10 weeks of bread for a household that needs to eat until the following summer. Outside, her husband walks the muddy border of the field for the third time that day, as if the wheat that failed to grow there might somehow still appear if he only looks hard enough. She is not alone in this, though. From inside her own walls it must have felt that way. Scholars who have spent careers reconstructing this period tell us that what was happening in her bin that October was happening in some form in tens of thousands of households at once, from the edges of Ireland to the borders of Poland. It is one of those strange, quiet facts of history that a disaster this vast can begin with something as small and private as a woman's hand reaching into an empty corner of her own kitchen. There is something else worth sitting with before we go further. The world this woman lives in has not known true widespread famine for generations. Her grandparents grew up hearing about hard years certainly, but not one like the one now closing in around her. And that it turns out may be part of what made the coming winter so devastating. A society can grow confident in its own abundance right up until the year abundance quietly stops arriving. Before we go any further into what happened next, I want to pause for just a moment. If this is the kind of history you've been looking for, the real story told the way it actually happened, without rushing past the parts that matter, it helps enormously if you take a moment to follow along and leave the video a like. It costs you nothing, and it makes a genuine difference in whether stories like this one keep getting told. And if you feel like it, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight and what drew you to this particular story. I read every one and I am always curious. For now though, let's get comfortable and let's keep going. What makes this story worth 3 hours of your night, I think, is not simply that people went hungry, though they did, and severely. It is what the hunger reveals, almost like a light shone sideways across an entire civilization, about how fragile even a confident, sophisticated society can be when the ground it depends on shifts beneath it. Northern Europe in 1315 is not a backward or primitive world. It has cathedrals rising into the sky, universities, courts, complex systems of law and trade stretching from London to the Baltic. And within 2 years, some of the very same towns that built those cathedrals will be burying their own citizens in numbers no living person there has ever seen before. There is a second thing worth sitting with, one of those small facts that tends to surprise people the first time they hear it. The King of England himself, at the height of this crisis, will find it genuinely difficult to buy bread for his own royal household while travelling through the countryside. Wealth, it turns out, buys a family time. It does not in a famine severe enough buy them food that does not exist. And there is a third thread we will return to later in the story, one that historians are still even now working to fully untangle. The exact reasons the rains would not stop that year, and why they struck this particular region with this particular force, sit at the edge of what the historical and scientific record can tell us with full certainty. We will look closely later on at what the evidence does and does not support, and at the honest disagreements that remain. For now, though, let's stay close to the ground, close to that woman in Flanders kneeling beside her half-empty bin, because her story is really the beginning of all of it. She does not know yet on this grey October afternoon that she is standing at the opening of one of the most punishing stretches in the whole of medieval European history. She only knows that the numbers in front of her are not enough, and that somewhere beyond her low wooden door, an entire world built carefully over 2 centuries of good harvests and growing towns is about to be tested in a way it has never faced before. To understand how she came to be kneeling there counting grain that isn't there, we have to step back first, further than her own lifetime, and look at the world that raised her, the one that convinced an entire continent that plenty was simply how things were. To find the world that shaped her, we do not need to travel far in space, only backward in time to the closing years of the 1200s and the opening decades of the 1300s, when this particular part of Europe is by nearly every measure available to us thriving. It helps to understand what medieval abundance actually looked like, because it is not abundance in the way we might picture it now. There are no granaries stacked high enough to weather 3 bad years in a row. There is no shipping network capable of moving surplus grain quickly across an entire continent when one region falls short. Wealth in this world is almost entirely local, almost entirely seasonal, and almost entirely tied to a single harvest that either comes in or it does not. A good year means bread ale and a little left over for the church, the Lord, and the following spring seed. A bad year means going without something. Nobody in this world has yet lived through a year that meant going without nearly everything. And for roughly 2 centuries before our story begins, the years have mostly been good ones. Historians who study climate through tree rings, lake sediments, and glacier ice describe this earlier stretch as a period of unusually favourable growing conditions across much of Europe. One that allowed fields to be pushed further north, further uphill, and further onto land that had never been farmed before. Villages that started as a handful of families grow into proper settlements. Forests are cleared, marshes are drained. In the county of Flanders alone, engineers spend generations building an extraordinary system of dikes and canals to reclaim farmland directly from the sea. A project so ambitious that some of it still shapes the landscape of the region today. This is worth pausing on, because it is one of those details people rarely associate with the medieval world. We tend to imagine the Middle Ages as static as a long grey stretch of mud and hardship. But the 2 centuries before our famine are in agricultural terms a genuine boom. Population roughly doubles across large parts of Europe. Towns that have been little more than crossroads become genuine centres of trade and craft. The cathedrals rising over cities like Amiens and Cologne during this period are not built by a struggling subsistence society. They are built by a continent that for the first time in centuries believes it has room to spare. That belief matters because it shapes decisions. As population grows, families need more land, and the best land, the land closest to rivers, the land with the deepest soil, is already taken. What remains is marginal ground, hillsides, forest edges, low-lying fields prone to flooding land that will produce a decent crop in a good year, and almost nothing at all in a bad one. Families settle it anyway because the alternative is having nowhere to settle at all. It's a completely reasonable choice made by millions of individual households, each one solving their own immediate problem. And it is also without anyone intending it a continent quietly building itself a much narrower margin for error than it realizes. Here is where the story gets genuinely interesting and a little uncomfortable, because the evidence on what actually connects this earlier growth to the disaster that follows is not as tidy as it might sound. Scholars still debate how much of the coming famine can be traced to overpopulation and marginal farmland, and how much came down almost entirely to weather that no amount of careful planning could have prepared anyone for. Some historians argue that Northern Europe by 1315 was already living close to the edge of what its land could support, so that even an ordinary bad harvest would have caused real suffering. Others argue that the weather itself, the sheer sustained wrongness of it, was severe enough that it would have overwhelmed almost any agricultural system of the period, rich soil or poor. The honest answer, based on what survives in the record, is probably some combination of both, though historians continue to weigh exactly how much each factor contributed. What is not in dispute is how differently this looming crisis will land on different households, because medieval society is not one uniform mass of people all facing the same odds. A wealthy monastery with stone storehouses, tenant farms scattered across several different regions, and centuries of accumulated land can absorb a bad year, sometimes even two, without its monks going hungry. A great lord similarly draws income and grain from dozens of separate holdings, so that a poor harvest in one place is cushioned by a better one somewhere else on his lands. Towns, for their part, often maintain some form of communal grain reserve, a hedge against exactly this kind of emergency, though those reserves are usually modest and were never designed to withstand a true sustained catastrophe. It is the ordinary rural household, the small tenant farm, the family working perhaps 10 or 15 acres of land they do not even own outright, that carries almost none of this protection. Their entire year's food supply typically comes from a single plot farmed with their own labour stored in their own home. There is no second holding to fall back on if this one fails. And for a family already living close to subsistence after a merely average harvest the year before, even a modestly disappointing crop can tip them from difficulty into genuine danger. This is the quiet structural truth sitting underneath everything that follows. When the rains finally come, they do not simply strike a continent. They strike a deeply uneven one, and the households with the thinnest margins are the ones standing closest to the edge already. There is a human detail here worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy from 7 centuries away to see only the abstract shape of a famine. The statistics, the dates, the broad strokes of cause and consequence. It helps to remember that every one of those thin margins belonged to an actual family, making actual decisions based on the information available to them at the time. The woman we met kneeling by her grain bin in Flanders had no way of knowing, in the autumn of 1314, that the coming year would be different from any other. She planted the way her family had always planted. She stored what she had always stored. The system that had carried her parents and grandparents through their entire lives had simply never asked more of the land than the land until now had always been willing to give. And this is where something genuinely strange begins to happen, something the written record from this period captures with unusual clarity. Beginning in the spring of 1315, the rain arrives, and it does not stop in any of the ways rain is supposed to stop. Monastic chroniclers across England come. France and the Low Countries men, whose job it was simply to record the notable events of each year, start writing about weather with a kind of bewildered urgency that stands out sharply against their usually measured formal Latin. Fields that should be drying out in early summer remain waterlogged. Roads become impassable. In some regions, the rain is heavy enough and constant enough that it is remembered decades later as unlike anything within living memory. What caused this particular stretch of relentless rain is another place where the evidence remains genuinely incomplete. Modern climate scientists studying this period point to a broader gradual shift in the North Atlantic climate system, beginning around this time, one that would eventually be recognized as the early edge of what is now called the Little Ice Age, a centuries-long cooling trend that reshaped weather patterns across Europe. But the precise mechanism behind this specific run of catastrophic rainfall in 1314 and 1315, why it struck with such severity in these particular years in this particular place, is still something researchers are working to fully reconstruct from tree rings, ice cores, and the scattered human observations left behind in monastery ledgers and merchant account books. What we do know with far more certainty is what this rain did to the people standing beneath it, because the wheat in the fields does not care about the underlying climatology. It simply drowns or rots on the stalk or never ripens at all. And for a family like the one we have been sitting with watching this happen is not an abstract climate event. It is watching day after grey day, the only thing standing between their household and hunger slowly, visibly failing in front of them, with absolutely nothing they can do to stop it. That is the position an entire region finds itself in as the summer of 1315 wears on, still holding out hope, still watching the sky, still believing the way people generally do, that surely this cannot go on much longer. What actually happens next as that hope runs out along with everything else is where we turn our attention now. By late summer of 1315, hope has become a harder thing to hold on to with any real conviction. The rain that soaked the spring planting does not simply pass through and leave the rest of the year alone. It keeps returning week after week through June and July, and into August, the months when a field is supposed to be doing its quiet, essential work of ripening under a dry sun. Instead, wheat stalks that manage to survive the waterlogged soil come up stunted and pale, heavy with damp rather than grain. Chroniclers writing in monasteries across England describe fields so thoroughly flooded that some crops simply could not be harvested at all, left to rot standing in the water that drowned them. When the harvest finally comes in, what farmers are left holding is not simply a smaller crop. In many regions, it is barely half of an ordinary year's yield, and in the very worst hit areas, considerably less than that. It's worth understanding what a shortfall of that size actually does to a medieval market, because the mathematics of scarcity in this period behave in a way that can feel almost counterintuitive. A modern harvest failure of 10 or 20% might raise prices noticeably. In a pre-industrial grain market where almost the entire population depends on bread as the core of daily survival, and where there is no meaningful way to import large quantities of food quickly from elsewhere, a shortfall of this size does something closer to breaking the market outright. Grain prices across large parts of England, France, and the Low Countries do not simply rise. Within months, in some towns, they climb to roughly 4 times what they had been the previous year. Bread, the single most basic food a medieval household depends on, becomes something an ordinary labourer can no longer reliably afford, even when working every day that work is available. There is a detail from this period that tends to surprise people the first time they hear it, because it reveals something about how governments respond to crisis that feels almost startlingly familiar. In the spring of 1315, as prices first begin climbing, the government of King Edward II in England attempts something that sounds on its surface like a reasonable and even compassionate response. Parliament issues a formal proclamation fixing the maximum price that can legally be charged for grain for livestock and for a range of other foodstuffs in an effort to protect ordinary people from being priced entirely out of the market. It is in its intention an act of mercy. In practice, it very nearly makes the crisis worse. Farmers and merchants holding what little surplus grain remains find that selling it at the newly fixed price barely covers their own costs, let alone leaves anything resembling a profit. So many of them, quite reasonably from their own position, simply stop selling. Grain that might otherwise have reached the open market instead stays in private stores held back in the hope that prices will eventually rise again, or quietly diverted to buyers willing to pay above the legal limit in less visible transactions. The very policy designed to keep food affordable and available ends up making it scarcer still on the open market precisely when scarcity is the one thing an already desperate population can least afford. Within roughly a year, faced with markets that have effectively stalled, the price controls are quietly abandoned. This is one of those moments in history that resists a simple, satisfying moral. It is tempting to look back and judge the decision as foolish, but the historians who study medieval economic policy tend to be more careful than that. The government of the period had genuinely limited tools available to it. There was no capacity to coordinate large-scale food imports on the timeline. A crisis like this demanded no mechanism to compel hoarded grain onto the market, no reliable way to distinguish a merchant protecting his family's survival from one exploiting a desperate population. Price controls were in a sense the only lever available. That the lever backfired says less about the specific people pulling it than about how narrow the options genuinely were for anyone trying to govern through a disaster of this shape in this period. What this reveals underneath the specific policy failure is something quieter and more unsettling about how scarcity actually moves through a society. It does not distribute itself evenly, and it does not always follow the logic we might expect. A wealthy household with grain already stored from a previous good year can simply wait out a price spike largely untouched by it. A merchant holding surplus grain has every rational incentive to hold it back rather than sell at a loss, even while people in his own town go hungry because the alternative is jeopardizing his own family's survival for a stranger's benefit. Neither of these is villainy exactly. It is closer to what happens when an entire system built for ordinary years is asked to absorb an extraordinary one, and every individual within it is left making locally reasonable decisions that add up collectively to something far worse than any single person intended. For the family we have been following in Flanders, none of this unfolds as economic theory. It arrives as a series of increasingly difficult concrete choices made across the closing months of 1315. There is the decision of when exactly to begin slaughtering livestock that would ordinarily be kept through the winter for breeding or for milk, because feeding an animal through a season when there is not enough grain for the household itself is no longer a choice most families can afford to make. There is the decision of what, if anything, remains to be sold. Tools, spare, cloth, small pieces of household goods, in exchange for enough coin to buy grain at a price that has climbed far beyond what it should be. And there is a quieter, harder calculation still, one that surviving court and manor records from this period occasionally hint at which member of a household eats first and how much when there is simply not enough for everyone to eat fully. Scholars still debate exactly how widespread and how severe these individual household crises became in this first winter, because the surviving evidence is uneven. Manor records and tax rolls tend to capture the movement of land and money far more reliably than they capture private suffering inside a single home. What survives in the written record chronicles price data, occasional court cases over stolen grain or disputed debts, gives historians a clear outline of the crisis at the level of markets and institutions, but a much blurrier picture of what it actually felt like night after night inside an ordinary household trying to stretch an impossible amount of food across an entire season. It is one of the genuine limits of what history, even careful, well-documented history, can fully recover. What does survive clearly and repeatedly across chronicles from multiple different regions is a simple, striking fact. This is not a localized misfortune striking one unlucky village. By the close of 1315, contemporaries writing in England, in France, in the Low Countries, and across parts of what is now Germany, are independently describing a shortage on a scale none of them had personal experience of before. A crisis this widespread, striking so many separate political territories at once, each with their own government, their own markets, their own harvest, tells us something important. Whatever is happening here is bigger than any single king's policy, any single region's poor planning. It is closer to a shared environmental catastrophe that simply does not respect political borders, arriving in kitchen after kitchen across an entire stretch of the continent in more or less the same season. And so autumn gives way to winter, the season the family in Flanders had already quietly done the arithmetic on months before. The grain bin she knelt beside back in October has not grown any fuller since. If anything, what remained in it has already begun carefully to be rationed. What lies ahead as the days shorten and the temperature drops is the part of this story that surviving chroniclers found hardest to write about clearly, and the part we're going to sit with next, without flinching from it, but without rushing toward it either: winter. When it finally settles in over Flanders that year does not arrive as a single dramatic turn. It arrives the way winter always does, a little colder each week, the daylight shortening by minutes rather than hours, so that for a while it is almost possible to pretend nothing unusual is happening at all. That illusion does not survive December. By the closing weeks of 1315, something becomes clear across village after village, that the earlier months of anxious rationing had not fully prepared anyone for hunger on its own, is rarely what actually kills people in a famine of this scale. It is what hunger does to everything else. A body that is not getting enough food loses the strength to fight off illnesses that in an ordinary year would pass through a household as a bad week or two. A fever, a stomach complaint, nothing more. Malnourished, that same illness can turn fatal within days, particularly in the very young and the very old. Historians studying mortality records from this period thin and scattered, as they are generally agree that disease riding alongside hunger, rather than outright starvation by itself, accounts for a substantial share of the deaths that follow, though the exact proportion remains difficult to pin down with real precision, since medieval records rarely distinguish clearly between the two. This is one of those details that tends to reshape how people picture a famine once they actually sit with it. We tend to imagine starvation as a single visible thing, a body simply running out of food. The reality as it unfolds across Flanders and England and France that winter is quieter and more tangled than that. It is a fever that would have passed in an ordinary year instead, settling into a child's chest and staying there. It is dysentery moving through a household already too weakened to recover from it the way it might have 12 months earlier. Death, in other words, arrives wearing several different faces at once, and separating out which one did the actual killing is something even the people living through it could not always have told you with certainty. There is a surprising layer to this story that few people outside academic circles tend to know, and it concerns the animals rather than the people. Livestock across the affected regions are suffering une crisis in parallel, weakened by the same relentless wet weather, the same shortage of decent fodder standing in flooded pastures that leave them vulnerable to illness in ways healthy, well-fed animals typically are not. Within a few years of the famine's worst point, a separate and devastating cattle disease will sweep across much of the same territory, striking herds already thinned by years of hardship and killing, a significant share of Europe's cattle population in a single sustained wave. We are not there yet in our story tonight, but it is worth knowing even now that the ground beneath this recovering world will not be given very much time to steady itself before it is tested again. For the family in Flanders, none of this arrives as a set of statistics. It arrives as decisions made quietly inside a single small home, week after week through the darkest stretch of that winter. What survives in scattered court records and charitable account books from towns across the region suggests a pattern repeating itself, with variation in household after household. Food increasingly directed toward whoever in the family seemed most likely to survive on it. Most often the children, sometimes at real cost to the health of the adults doing the deciding. It is not a dramatic or cinematic kind of sacrifice. It looks from the outside almost unremarkable, a parent quietly eating less night after night and saying nothing about it. And yet it is one of the clearest, most consistent human patterns that survives from famines across very different times and places. This instinct, even under genuine desperation to protect the smallest and most vulnerable first. What does a household do when every option left in front of it costs something precious? That is more or less the shape of the choice facing thousands of families this winter, and it is worth sitting with for a moment rather than rushing past it, because it is the quiet engine driving almost everything else in this story. Sell the last of the tools and risk not being able to plant properly once spring finally comes. Or keep the tools and go hungrier now betting on a spring that has not. This particular year kept its promises. Institutions try to respond in the ways available to them. Monasteries across the region, many of which maintain a long tradition of distributing alms and surplus food to the poor, open their stores more widely than usual, and some town governments increase spending on relief for the destitute, records of which survive in a handful of surviving municipal accounts. But the scale of the crisis quickly outpaces what any single monastery or town treasury can meaningfully absorb. A charitable distribution that might comfortably support the usual population of poor and elderly in an ordinary winter is simply not built to stretch across a population where a much larger share of everyone, not just the traditionally poor, now genuinely needs help. This mismatch produces one of the more understated but significant shifts of the period, one that shows up clearly in the surviving records, a steady movement of people away from the countryside and toward towns. It makes a certain rough sense from where a struggling rural family stands. A town, even a struggling one, holds markets, charitable institutions, and the faint possibility of paid work, none of which exist in the same way out in an isolated farming village where the failed harvest is the only economy there is. So families begin leaving small holdings behind, sometimes temporarily, sometimes for good, walking towards towns that are themselves already straining under their own version of the same crisis. Urban populations swell precisely at the moment urban food supplies are least able to absorb the increase, a pattern historians studying medieval famine have noted repeating itself in different forms across other crises in other centuries as well. Scholars still debate how large this migration actually was in real numbers, since surviving records capture only fragments of it, a scattering of court cases over abandoned tenancies, occasional mentions in town chronicles of unusually large numbers of strangers arriving. What the evidence does make clear is the direction of the movement and the desperation behind it. People are not leaving their homes and their land some families have worked for generations, because anything about that choice is easy. They are leaving because staying has become, for the first time in living memory, more dangerous than going. Back in the household we've been following, that particular choice has not yet been made, not this winter at least. There is still just enough grain in the bin, carefully measured, carefully rationed, to hold on a little longer where they are. But word is beginning to travel along the roads and market paths connecting one village to the next, the way word always does in a crisis like this, carried by travellers and traders and the occasional desperate family passing through, on their way towards some town that might have more to offer than the field they left behind. And what that word is beginning to carry as 1315 closes and 1316 opens is that this winter, the one everyone had hoped might simply be a hard patch to endure, is not yet finished getting worse. Spring is supposed to be the turning point in a story like this one. It rarely works out that neatly, and 1316 is no exception. Across Flanders, England, and much of northern France, farmers go back into the fields that spring carrying something close to desperate hope, planting whatever seed grain they manage to hold back through the winter, instead of eating it, a genuinely difficult sacrifice in itself, since every handful set aside for planting is a handful not going into anyone's mouth that week. It is in its own quiet way one of the harder decisions a starving household has to make. Eat the seed now and guarantee nothing grows later, or plant it and gamble an entire family's near-term survival on a harvest that is still months away, and entirely at the mercy of a sky that has not been trustworthy in nearly 2 years. The rains return, not immediately and not everywhere with equal force, but through the late spring and early summer of 1316, much of the same weather pattern that ruined the previous year settles back over the region. Fields flood again. Grain that does sprout struggles in waterlogged, exhausted soil that has not had a real chance to recover. When historians reconstruct the yields from this second harvest using what survives in manor accounts and tithe records, the pictures that emerges is almost worse than the first failure, not because the weather itself was necessarily more extreme, but because it struck a population, a soil and a set of household reserves that had already been stripped bare the year before. There was no cushion left to absorb a second blow. 1316, more than the year before, it is the point at which this crisis stops being a hard winter and becomes something closer to a sustained catastrophe. This is the point in the story where a detail from part 1 is worth returning to properly, because we mentioned it only in passing at the very start and it deserves its full context now. In the summer of 1316, King Edward II of England is travelling through the countryside near St Albans, north of London, with his royal household, the kind of travelling court that would ordinarily expect towns and monasteries along its route to provide food and hospitality as a matter of course. According to the chronicle account that survives from St Albans Abbey itself, the king's party arrives to find that there is quite simply not enough bread available locally to feed his household properly. It is a genuinely startling detail once you sit with it. This is not a struggling peasant family we're talking about. This is the reigning monarch of England travelling with the full authority and resources of the crown behind him, and even he cannot simply purchase his way around a famine severe enough to have emptied the granaries of an entire region. It is worth pausing on why that detail matters so much beyond its simple novelty. Wealth and power in an ordinary crisis function as a kind of insulation. A king can outbid anyone for scarce grain. A king's household can draw on royal estates scattered across the country so that a shortage in one region is covered by surplus somewhere else. What the St Albans account suggests is a famine severe enough and widespread enough that even that layer of insulation was in this particular case, and this particular place, not fully sufficient. There simply was not enough food circulating in the local market for money alone to solve the problem instantly. It is one of those rare moments where the historical record lets us see with unusual clarity just how far the floor had genuinely dropped out from under an entire region's food supply. There is an honest complication worth naming here, one that careful historians are consistently upfront about. A single chronicle account, even a detailed and generally reliable one like the St Albans record, is still one narrator's version of events written, with its own emphasis and its own sense of what was worth recording for posterity. Monastic chroniclers of this period were not neutral statisticians. They were often writing consciously or not to underscore a moral point, sometimes about the fragility of earthly power, sometimes about divine judgment on a sinful age. That does not mean the core event. The king's household genuinely struggling to secure bread is fabricated. Multiple details in the surrounding record support that the crisis in this particular region and season was severe, but historians remain careful as a matter of good practice to weigh a vivid single account like this one against the broader pattern of evidence, rather than treating any one chronicler's telling as the complete picture on its own. What was actually happening, meanwhile, further down the social order away from any royal chronicle's attention? This is where the record grows thinner, and where honesty about the limits of what we know matters most. Surviving court records from several English and French towns during this period document a rise in prosecutions for theft of food-grain livestock, stored provisions, a pattern that suggests even without anyone stating it outright, communities under real strain, ordinary people making choices under pressure most of us have never had to face. Some chroniclers writing at a distance from events they did not personally witness include darker rumours circulating during the worst months, including scattered and unverified claims of extreme desperation in the hardest hit areas. Historians who study this period urge real caution here, distinguishing a documented, corroborated event from a rumour repeated by a frightened chronicler working from second-hand reports sometimes written years after the fact is genuinely difficult and reputable. Modern scholarship treats the more extreme claims from this period as unverified rather than established fact. What can be stated with confidence based on solid corroborated evidence is severe widespread hunger, elevated mortality, and social strain intense enough to show up clearly in court and municipal records across multiple separate regions. That on its own, without needing embellishment, is already a genuinely staggering picture. There is a quieter, more solidly documented consequence worth sitting with. Instead, one that speaks just as powerfully to the depth of the crisis without straying into uncertain territory. Livestock theft cases rise sharply in the court records of this period, and it is not difficult to understand why. A single stolen sheep or cow represented to a desperate household weeks of food that the formal market at famine prices had placed entirely out of reach. Town and manor courts, for their part, appear to have shown a measure of leniency in some of these cases that stands out against their normal severity, a detail some historians read as an implicit, unspoken acknowledgement, even within a rigid medieval legal system, that ordinary rules were straining under extraordinary circumstances. Why did some communities respond with a degree of mercy while others held firm to the letter of the law regardless of circumstance? It is a genuinely open question, and the honest answer is that the surviving records do not give us a single clean explanation. Local governance in this period varies enormously from one town to the next, shaped by the particular temperament of local officials, the relative severity of the famine in that specific area, and factors that simply have not survived in any written form for us to recover. It is one of the places where the historical record, however, rich in some respects, ultimately runs up against its own limits, and where the most honest thing a historian can say is that we do not and likely never will know the full answer. What we can trace with real confidence is the broader arc taking shape across these 2 consecutive years of failure. Mortality estimates for the famine as a whole, drawn from the painstaking work of historical demographers piecing together tithe records, manor rolls, and surviving parish data, generally suggest that somewhere between 5 and 12% of the population across the hardest hit regions of Northern Europe died as a direct or indirect result of this crisis, figures that vary considerably depending on the specific area studied, and that scholars continue to refine as more regional records are analysed. To put a number like that into proportion, it means that in some communities something close to 1 out of every 10 or 12 people who were alive at the start of 1315 simply were not there anymore by the time the crisis finally eased. That is not an abstraction. That is a genuinely staggering hollowing out of ordinary community life, felt in empty seats at church in fields left untended, because the family that worked them no longer existed, in a silence that must have settled over the villages that only 3 years earlier had felt entirely secure in their own permanence. Back in Flanders, the family we have followed since the very opening of this story is, as 1316 wears on into its own difficult summer, still standing, still rationing, still making the same quiet, unglamorous calculations that have defined every month since that afternoon by the grain bin. Whether the second harvest still weeks away, whether it will finally be the one that breaks in their favour, is not something anyone in that household, or in any household like it across the entire region, can yet know for certain. What they do know by now, with a clarity that only 2 consecutive failed years can teach a person, is that hope, this time, is not something to be spent carelessly. It has to be rationed too in its own way, just like everything else. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that settles over a community after 2 consecutive failed harvests, one that is different in character from the sharp shock of that first bad autumn back in 1315. By the winter of 1316 into 1317, the crisis in Flanders and across much of northern Europe has stopped feeling like an emergency, in the usual sense of that word, a sudden crisis that everyone braces against and waits out. It has become instead simply the condition people are living in. The way a long illness eventually stops feeling like an event and starts feeling like a permanent fact of daily existence. This distinction matters more than it might seem to at first. Historians who study famine across many different periods and places have noted a recurring pattern in how communities respond to prolonged rather than sudden food crises. And it is worth understanding before we go further. In the early months of a shortage, households tend to hold on to normal social structures fairly tightly, sharing what little surplus exists with neighbours, maintaining the usual obligations of charity and kinship. As a crisis stretches past a year and then toward two, those structures come under a different kind of pressure entirely, not because people become less caring, but because the margin available for generosity simply shrinks toward nothing. A family that could spare a little grain for an elderly widow down the road in the autumn of 1315 may, by the second winter, have nothing at all left to spare, not because their character has changed, but because their own children now depend on every last handful. What survives in the record from Flemish towns during this second winter reflects exactly this shift. Municipal charitable spending, which had increased notably in the first year of the crisis, begins in several towns to plateau or even decline in the second, not from any lack of will on the part of town governments, but because the tax-base funding that charity drawn from a population already stripped of surplus income simply has less and less left to give. It is one of the quieter, more mechanical cruelties of a prolonged famine, one that rarely makes it into the more dramatic retellings of this period. The very mechanisms built to help the most vulnerable are themselves slowly starved of the resources they need to function at precisely the moment they are needed most. And yet amid all of this, something does finally begin to shift, and it is worth sitting with how genuinely uncertain it must have felt in the moment, because nobody living through it could have known with any confidence that relief was actually coming. Through the early months of 1317, the weather across northern Europe begins gradually and unevenly to change. The relentless rain that had defined the previous two growing seasons eases. It does not vanish overnight, and different regions experience the shift at different speeds and to different degrees. But chroniclers writing in this period begin for the first time in nearly 3 years to describe something almost startling in its ordinariness. A spring that behaves the way a spring is supposed to behave. It's genuinely difficult viewing this moment from 7 centuries away to overstate what an ordinary planting season must have meant to people who had by this point spent 3 consecutive years watching the sky with something close to dread. Fields that are planted in the spring of 1317 do not flood in the same catastrophic way. Wheat that sprouts has a real chance to ripen properly under something closer to normal conditions. When the harvest finally comes in that autumn, it is not by most surviving accounts an especially abundant one. Soil across the region has been battered by 3 years of poor drainage and overuse, and many farms are working with a fraction of the livestock and therefore a fraction of the manure and ploughing power that they had at the crisis's start. But it is crucially enough. For the first time since the summer of 1314, a harvest across this part of Europe comes in close to what the region actually needs to feed itself through the following winter. This is in the fullest sense of the phrase the turning point of the entire crisis, though it is worth being honest about what that phrase does and does not mean here. It does not mean the suffering simply stops the way a switch flips from famine to plenty. Grain prices, though they begin to ease from their previous extremes, remain elevated for some time afterward, and the population, both human and animal, that the famine has already claimed does not return. Families that lost members' land or livestock during the worst of the crisis do not simply recover those losses because the rain has finally stopped. What the harvest of 1317 actually represents is something narrower, and in its own way just as significant the moment the trajectory of the disaster changes direction from a crisis that had been steadily worsening for 3 straight years to one that, however slowly and unevenly, finally begins to ease. There is a detail from this recovery period that surprises people almost every time it comes up, because it runs against the instinct to imagine relief arriving as a clean, uncomplicated good thing. The very same regions that had suffered most severely during the famine's peak find themselves in the years immediately following 1317 dealing with a different and unexpected problem, a shortage of labour. Between the direct deaths from hunger and disease and the migration of families away from devastated rural areas toward towns during the worst years, some agricultural districts genuinely struggle to find enough hands to work land that in an ordinary year would have had no shortage of willing tenants. It is a strange, almost paradoxical inheritance of the crisis, one that some economic historians argue quietly reshaped the balance of power between landholders and labourers in parts of northern Europe for a generation or more afterward, though the scholarship on exactly how significant and how lasting that particular effect really was remains genuinely divided. What does it actually mean for a society to recover from something like this? It is a fair question to sit with for a moment, because recovery in the case of the Great Famine does not look like a return to exactly the world that existed before 1315. It looks more like a landing on new ground entirely shaped by everything the crisis changed along the way. The households that no longer exist, the land use patterns that shift as the most marginal. Most flood-prone fields are gradually abandoned in favour of safer ground, the quiet, lasting wariness that surely settled into a generation of farmers who had watched firsthand just how quickly the world they trusted could turn against them. Back in the household we have followed from the very opening of this story, the harvest of 1317 arrives. We can reasonably imagine not as a moment of celebration, exactly, but as something quieter and more hard-won than that, a kind of cautious, disbelieving relief. The bin that had been measured and rationed for 3 consecutive years finally has something real going back into it. Whether this particular family survived intact to see that moment, whether every member who knelt beside that bin back in the autumn of 1315 is still there to see it filled, again, is something the surviving record focused as it is on markets and mortality figures, rather than individual households, simply cannot tell us with certainty. It is one of the honest gaps in this story, and probably always will be. What the record can tell us with far more confidence is what happens next once the immediate crisis of hunger finally begins to loosen its grip on the region. Because a disaster of this size does not simply end when the last bad harvest is replaced by a good one. It leaves behind a different kind of evidence entirely, the kind that takes centuries rather than seasons to fully read written, not in chronicles or price rolls this time, but in the very bones of the people who lived through it. Bones remember things that chronicles forget. That is not in itself a poetic exaggeration. It is a fairly literal description of what modern bioarchaeology has learned to read in human skeletal remains, and it is one of the most striking ways we have of understanding what a famine like this one actually did to the bodies of the people who lived through it, rather than simply to the markets and mortality figures that survive in written records. When a child's body goes through a period of severe nutritional stress, whether from famine, sustained illness, or some combination of the two, the long bones of the legs and arms, which are actively growing throughout childhood, sometimes record that stress in a physical way. Growth slows or briefly halts during the period of deprivation, then resumes once conditions improve, and that interruption can leave a faint horizontal line inside the bone itself, visible on an X-ray or under careful examination decades or even centuries later. Researchers call these Harris lines named for the physician who first described them systematically in the early 20th century. And while a single line cannot tell you exactly what caused the stress behind it, a cluster of these lines appearing across a particular age range in skeleton after skeleton from the same cemetery tells a much clearer collective story. Archaeologists working with medieval burial populations from London and several other English and continental cities have examined exactly this kind of evidence in skeletons dating to the early decades of the 1300s, and the pattern that emerges is difficult to read as coincidence. Individuals who would have been children during the years of the Great Famine show a measurably higher incidence of these growth interruption lines than those from the generations immediately before or after them. Alongside this, researchers also look for a condition called cribra orbitalia, a subtle porous change in the bone of the eye sockets associated with chronic anemia, often linked to poor nutrition in childhood, and this too appears with notably increased frequency in remains from this particular period. There is something quietly remarkable about what this means. It means the famine we've been following through chronicles and price records and court cases did not end when the good harvest of 1317 finally came in. For the children who survived those 3 brutal years, it left a mark that stayed with them written into the architecture of their own skeletons, legible to researchers examining those same bones 7 centuries later. A person could live a full adult life after 1317, marry, raise their own children, never once mention the famine years in any surviving record, and still carry quite literally inside their own bones physical evidence of exactly how hard those years had been. Scholars working in this field are careful appropriately about how far this evidence can be pushed. A Harris line or an instance of cribra orbitalia cannot be dated with pinpoint precision to a single specific year, and both conditions can result from causes other than famine, general childhood illness among them, so no individual skeleton can be said with total certainty to be a direct, isolated product of the 1315 crisis specifically rather than of some other episode of hardship in that same person's early life. What gives researchers real confidence is the pattern across an entire population, a measurable spike in these markers concentrated in individuals whose childhood years line up with the famine compared with the general background rate found in surrounding generations. It is exactly the kind of evidence historians mean when they talk about triangulating a picture from multiple different independent sources, chronicles here, price records there, and now added to the picture the direct physical testimony of the human body itself. There is a further layer to this research that surprises most people the first time they encounter it, because it extends the famine's reach further than the mortality figures alone would suggest. Several studies of medieval skeletal populations in England have documented a measurable dip in average adult stature among individuals who would have experienced early childhood during this famine period compared with both earlier and later generations. Severe malnutrition during the first few years of life can permanently affect how tall a person eventually grows, even if that same person goes on to eat perfectly well for the rest of their adult years. In other words, some portion of an entire generation across Northern Europe appears to have grown into physically shorter adults than either their parents or their own children, would become a quiet, permanent bodily inheritance of 3 catastrophic growing seasons that none of them, as infants, could possibly have understood they were living through. Is it strange to think that a rainstorm in the spring of 1314 might still be measurably readable in a human skeleton excavated in London 800 years later? It is, and yet that is precisely what this branch of research allows us to see, a kind of evidence entirely unavailable to the medieval chroniclers who wrote about this famine in their own lifetime, working only with what they could personally observe and record. They knew people were dying. They could not have known, and had no way of knowing, that the crisis would leave a legible trace in the very architecture of the survivors' bones, a trace patient enough to wait 7 centuries for someone with the right training and the right instruments to finally come along and read it. This kind of evidence also lets historians ask and partially answer questions that written sources alone could never fully resolve. Chronicles written almost exclusively by educated clergy tend to focus heavily on events touching the church, the nobility and major towns leaving the experience of the rural poor, the overwhelming majority of the actual population comparatively thin in the written record. Skeletal remains do not share that bias in the same way. A body buried in a modest parish cemetery carries the same kind of physical evidence as one buried within a grand cathedral. And in some respects, bioarchaeology has become one of the most valuable tools historians have for recovering the experience of exactly the people whom the written chronicles of this period were least inclined to write much about. The evidence remains incomplete, and researchers are honest about the limits of what any single excavation can tell us. Skeletal populations available for this kind of study are unevenly distributed, concentrated in a handful of well-excavated urban cemeteries rather than spread evenly across the whole affected region, which means the picture we have is genuinely richer for certain cities than for the wider countryside where the majority of medieval Europeans actually lived. Some regions hit hard by the famine based on chronicle and price evidence have simply not yielded comparable skeletal studies yet, either because suitable burial sites have not been excavated or because the specific research has not been done. What we have, in other words, is a strong scientifically grounded window into how this crisis marked the human body, but not yet a complete continent-wide picture, and responsible historians are careful never to claim more certainty than the current evidence actually supports. There is something worth sitting with in closing this particular thread about what it means that we can even ask these questions at all. For most of human history, a famine like this one would have simply vanished into a handful of brief formal chronicle entries, a paragraph here, a passing reference to hard times there, and then silence the individual human cost of it lost entirely to time. The fact that we can now stand in a laboratory 700 years later and identify the faint physical signature of a 3-year-old crisis inside the bones of a person who never once appears by name in any surviving document is one of the genuinely remarkable achievements of modern historical science. It does not restore that person's name to us. It restores something else quieter, but still real, the simple confirmed fact that they were here, that this happened to them specifically, and that what happened left a mark real enough for us to still find it. All this time later, knowing what the crisis did to the body is one kind of understanding. It leaves open a different, equally important question, the one that turns our attention now away from bones and back toward daily life. What exactly did people actually do day to day, while all of this was happening around them to try to hold their own households together against odds this steep? That is where we turn next. That, long before anyone reaches for the more desperate options, history remembers this famine. For there is a quieter, less dramatic economy of survival that most households turn to first, and it deserves its own attention, because it is where the vast majority of families spent most of these 3 years, not in extremity, but in a kind of relentless, resourceful ordinariness. The first thing an ordinary household does once it becomes clear the grain will not stretch is stop eating the way it used to eat long before it runs out of food entirely. Bread in this period is typically made from a careful mixture of grains, wheat, where possible blended with rye barley or oats depending on the region and the household's means. As shortages deepen, that mixture shifts. Households across Flanders and England begin cutting their flour with whatever else can plausibly be ground and bakes dried peas, beans, and in the more desperate stretches documented by several chroniclers, even acorns and other foraged materials never normally considered fit for human bread at all. The resulting loaf is coarser, harder to digest, and considerably less nourishing than ordinary bread. But it stretches a diminishing supply of proper grain across more meals and more weeks than pure wheat flour ever could on its own. This kind of substitution rarely makes it into the more dramatic tellings of this famine, and that is worth pausing on for a moment because it is arguably one of the most historically significant details of the entire crisis, precisely because of how unremarkable it looks on the surface. It represents thousands of individual households independently, without any coordination between them arriving at the same basic survival strategy, stretching what little remained through ingenuity rather than simply giving up once the ideal ingredients ran out. It is not a heroic detail in the way a dramatic rescue or a defiant last stand might be. It is something quieter, and in its own way more admirable, ordinary people simply refusing to stop trying meal after meal for years. Foraging expands well beyond bread substitutes into the surrounding landscape itself. Surviving accounts and later agricultural records from this period describe a marked increase in the gathering of wild greens roots, and whatever edible plant matter the countryside could offer foods that in an ordinary year might have been left largely to livestock, now carefully collected and prepared for human tables instead. Fishing intensifies wherever rivers, canals or coastline made it possible, and there is some evidence that communities near the Flemish coast leaned more heavily on shellfish and other marine foraging during these years than in more typical times, though. The direct documentary evidence for exactly how widespread this practice became is thinner than historians would ideally like, since foraged food, unlike grain sales or tithes, rarely generated the kind of written record that survives for us to study today. What did a family actually do once foraging and stretched bread were no longer enough on their own? The next step for most households was selling. Not selling in the abstract sense we might imagine from a distance, but selling specific, painful, individually chosen things, one at a time as the crisis deepened. Surviving manor court records from several English counties document exactly this pattern. Tenants selling off small parcels of land, sometimes just a strip or two of a larger holdings, to wealthier neighbours, or to the local monastery in exchange for enough coin or grain to survive the immediate crisis. It is a genuinely significant moment in a family's history, the kind of decision that would have been almost unthinkable in an ordinary year. Land in this period being something families typically held on to across generations, tied closely to identity and security. That households were willing to give up even a portion of it tells us, more clearly than almost any other single piece of evidence, just how narrow the alternative had become. Tools go next in many of these same records, followed by household goods, spare cloth, cooking vessels, anything with resale value that was not immediately required for day-to-day survival. And then in the hardest-hit households, livestock, the animals that represented both immediate food and long-term security breeding stock, dairy animals, working oxen needed for the very ploughing that next year's harvest would depend on. Selling or slaughtering a breeding animal for immediate food is, in the clearest possible terms, mortgaging the future against the present. And it is a measure of how severe this crisis became that so many households across the affected regions found themselves making exactly that trade not once but repeatedly across 3 consecutive difficult years. There is a detail here that tends to surprise people because it reveals something about how differently medieval society structured obligation compared with how we might imagine it. When a tenant family sold land to survive, the buyer was very often the local monastery, or a resident lord, not out of predatory opportunism in every case, but because these were frequently the only parties in a given village with sufficient reserves to purchase anything at all during a famine. Some monastic records from this period do show what modern historians would recognize as reasonably fair market transactions, even occasional evidence of lenient terms extended to struggling tenants. Other records, it must be said, honestly suggest less generous dealing, land acquired at prices that heavily favoured the buyer, during a moment when the seller had essentially no negotiating power whatsoever. Historians studying this period are careful not to flatten this into a single simple story of either charity or exploitation. Both patterns appear in the surviving evidence, sometimes within the very same region, and untangling which was more typical and why the variation existed at all remains an active area of scholarly work rather than a settled question. The Church more broadly occupied a genuinely complicated position throughout this crisis, one worth sitting with honestly rather than smoothing over. Monasteries were in many documented cases sources of real relief, distributing alms, opening grain stores to the poor, and in some instances forgiving or delaying debts owed by struggling tenants. At the very same time, the Church as an institution was also one of the largest landholders in the region, and therefore also unavoidably one of the parties acquiring land from desperate sellers during exactly this period. These two roles, generous relief and opportunistic acquisition, existed simultaneously, sometimes within the same monastery, sometimes even within the same set of surviving account books. It is not a contradiction historians try to resolve into a single tidy verdict. It is simply the genuine, uncomfortable complexity of how the institutions with real resources tend to behave during a prolonged crisis then as now. For families who exhausted these options, tools, land, livestock, foraging, the final path available was movement, and we touched briefly earlier on the broader pattern of migration toward towns. It is worth returning to that movement now at the level of the individual household, because the decision to actually leave a home or family may have worked for generations was rarely made lightly or all at once. Surviving records suggest a staged pattern in many cases, a husband or older son travelling, first seeking paid labour or charitable relief in a nearby town, sending back whatever could be spared while the rest of the family held on at the original holding for as long as possible. Only when that arrangement proved insufficient did the entire households typically make the fuller, more permanent move, arriving in towns that were themselves already straining, joining the ranks of the urban poor, seeking whatever charitable relief or occasional labour those towns could offer. Not every family that made this journey found what they were hoping for, and honesty requires saying so plainly. Some town governments, faced with an influx of struggling newcomers beyond what local charitable resources could realistically support, responded with restrictions on who could receive relief, occasionally favouring long-time residents over recent arrivals in ways that must have felt to a desperate family who had just walked days to reach a town's gates, like one more door quietly closing. This is not a detail Life Was Brutal includes to dwell in despair. It is included because it is true, and because it says something important and enduring about how communities under genuine strain sometimes struggle to extend the same generosity outward that they might in better years have offered without a second thought. And yet, running alongside every one of these hard, unglamorous decisions, the surviving record also preserves quieter evidence of persistence of households that made it through by doing exactly what households have always done in hard times: adjusting, adapting, helping where they still could, holding on to whatever thread of the ordinary they could manage to keep hold of. A family that stretched bread with foraged roots for 3 consecutive years and still somehow kept enough seed grain back to plant again. Each spring was not merely surviving passively, they were making an active, repeated, deliberate choice to keep believing that spring eventually would be worth planting for. By the time the harvest of 1317 finally comes in, changing the trajectory of the entire crisis, the family we have followed from the very first scene of this story, and countless families like them across the region, have already spent nearly 3 full years making exactly these kinds of decisions week after week, season after season. None of them dramatic on their own, all of them together, the true substance of what this famine actually was, at the level where it was actually lived. What remains now is to step back from any single household and look at how the wider world, the towns, the crowns, the institutions built to govern and protect an entire population responded to a crisis unfolding on this scale, and where those responses succeeded, where they fell painfully short, and what that gap still has to teach us. Grain in a crisis like this one does not respect borders, but the people responsible for governing during it were still bound entirely by them. And nowhere is that tension clearer than in how the great trading cities of the Low Countries tried, and largely failed, to buy their way out of catastrophe. Towns like Ypres, Bruges and Ghent, sophisticated commercial centres with real wealth and well-established trading networks stretching across the North Sea and into the Baltic, do not simply sit passively through this crisis. Municipal accounts surviving from several of these cities show town governments actively organising efforts to purchase grain from further afield, dispatching agents and ships toward regions that had not been struck as severely by the same catastrophic weather, hoping that money and established trading relationships could accomplish what local harvest no longer could. It is in its own way an early and instructive example of a pattern that recurs throughout history whenever local food systems fail wealthy, well-connected places, reaching outward, trying to import their way past a crisis that poorer, more isolated communities simply have no comparable means of escaping. The results were decidedly mixed, and the reasons why are worth sitting with, because they reveal something important about the actual limits of medieval trade networks. The rain and cold that devastated harvests across Flanders and England in these years were not confined neatly to those regions alone. Large stretches of France, Germany and Scandinavia experienced comparable difficulties, which meant that the grain surplus town agents hoped to purchase and ship home was, across much of the most obvious and accessible trading range, simply not available in the quantities needed. Some grain does make its way in from more distant regions, less affected by the crisis, and a handful of surviving records mention shipments arriving from as far as Mediterranean ports, though the logistics of moving bulk grain by sea across that distance in this period were genuinely difficult, and the quantities involved, however welcome to the specific communities that received them, were never remotely sufficient to resolve a shortage of this scale across an entire region. There is a particularly striking piece of evidence that survives from Ypres, specifically one that historians studying this famine return to again and again, because of how unusually direct and quantified it is compared with most sources from this period. The town's civic accounts from the crisis years include detailed records of burials paid for by the municipal government, a systematic tally kept, it seems, largely for administrative and financial purposes rather than any deliberate intention to document a famine for future historians. And yet that administrative record, preserved almost by accident, gives modern researchers something remarkably rare: a genuine, near-contemporary numerical window into mortality in a single town during the worst months of the crisis. The figures recorded suggest a substantial spike in deaths during this period compared with what the town's more ordinary years would have produced, a spike concentrated heavily in the poorer parishes of the city, consistent with everything else we know about who bore the heaviest burden of this famine. It's worth pausing on why a record like this matters so much to historians beyond the raw number itself. Most surviving evidence for this famine chronicles Price Rolls court cases, tells us about the crisis indirectly through its effects on markets, land and social behaviour. The Ypres burial accounts are one of the few sources that speak, even if imperfectly, and without any narrative commentary attached almost directly to the scale of death itself, recorded by officials who almost certainly had no idea their careful bookkeeping would still be read and studied 7 centuries later. Scholars remain appropriately cautious about extrapolating too broadly from a single town's records to the entire region, since urban mortality patterns do not necessarily map cleanly onto rural ones, and Ypres as a major trading centre may not be fully representative of smaller, more isolated communities. But within its own limits, it stands as one of the most valuable and directly quantitative pieces of evidence to survive from the entire crisis. Civic governments also turned inward toward their own populations in ways that echo and extend what we saw earlier with England's failed national price controls. Several Flemish towns attempted their own local versions of price regulation and in some cases direct civic purchase and distribution of grain to residents, an early and fairly sophisticated form of what we might now recognise as public food relief. Some towns went further still, passing ordinances against hoarding, empowering officials to inspect private grain stores and compel merchants suspected of withholding supply to bring it to market. The effectiveness of these measures appears to have varied considerably from town to town, shaped by the specific severity of the local shortage, the competence and honesty of the officials tasked with enforcement, and factors that once again simply have not survived clearly enough in the record for modern historians to fully reconstruct. What is consistent across nearly every surviving civic response, however, is the underlying recognition, sometimes stated explicitly in surviving municipal records, that this crisis had exceeded what ordinary governance had ever been designed to handle. These were for the most part competent functioning city governments accustomed to managing markets, trade disputes and the ordinary business of urban life with real skill. The famine asked something different of them entirely, and the historical record suggests they responded with genuine effort, considerable improvisation and only partial success, which is honestly very close to how most governments across history have responded to disasters that exceed the scale. Anything in their prior experience had prepared them for. There is a harder thread running alongside this civic story, one that deserves honest but careful acknowledgement, rather than either avoidance or dramatization. Several chroniclers writing during and shortly after the worst months of the crisis include references to extreme desperation in the hardest hit areas, rumours of behaviour so far outside the bounds of ordinary survival that modern historians treat them with real deliberate caution. These accounts were typically written by chroniclers working at some distance from the events they describe, often repeating second-hand reports rather than direct observation in a period and genre where dramatic rumour and moral warning frequently travel together in the same sentence. Reputable modern scholarship on the Great Famine generally treats these more extreme claims as unverified rather than established historical fact, a reflection of the genuine terror and desperation of the period, more than a reliable record of specific confirmed events. What historians can state with confidence based on solid and corroborated evidence is severe and widespread hunger, sharply elevated mortality and social strain intense enough to appear repeatedly in court and civic records across many different towns. That confirmed picture on its own needs no embellishment to convey the true weight of what this famine actually was. Why do some crises produce this kind of extreme rumour while others do not, even when the underlying suffering is comparably severe? It is a genuinely interesting question historians of famine have studied across many different periods and places, not just this one, and the pattern that emerges suggests these rumours tend to cluster around crises that are prolonged, geographically widespread and poorly served by reliable centralised information, exactly the conditions present across Northern Europe in these years. Fear in the absence of clear information tends to fill the silence with the worst available story, and chroniclers working without any of the verification tools a modern historian would insist on were not always equipped to separate genuine report from anxious rumour before committing it to parchment. Set against this harder thread, the surviving record also preserves something that deserves equal weight and attention: genuine documented acts of civic solidarity carried out under enormous strain. Guild records from several towns describe mutual aid funds ordinarily intended for members facing illness or misfortune being stretched and adapted during these years to help members through the famine, specifically. Some monasteries, as we touched on earlier, extended real and meaningful relief, not merely as isolated acts of individual kindness, but as organised, sustained institutional policy across the worst months of the crisis. And civic governments, whatever their limitations were, not idle bystanders watching their populations suffer without response, They tried with the tools and knowledge available to them, imperfectly and completely, but genuinely. This is in many respects the fullest and fairest picture. The surviving evidence allows us to draw of how the institutions responded to the Great Famine, neither purely heroic nor simply negligent, but recognizably humanly caught between real compassion and real limitation, between the genuine desire to help and the genuine absence in a pre-industrial world of the tools that might have helped more completely. It is worth remembering, as we consider all of this from the comfort of a world with refrigeration, global shipping and instant communication, how narrow the actual options available to anyone in this period genuinely were. Having looked closely now at what individual households did to survive, and how the towns and institutions around them tried with mixed success to help, there remains one more layer of this story worth examining before we turn to its longer consequences, and that is the question of how historians themselves, working centuries later, have come to understand and sometimes disagree about what actually happened here, and why those scholarly disagreements matter for how we should read this story at all. Historians who spend their careers studying the Great Famine tend to agree on very little when it comes to explaining why it happened the way it did, and that disagreement itself turns out to be one of the more illuminating parts of this story, because it reveals just how many different lenses a single historical event can be viewed through, each one genuinely defensible, none of them complete on its own. For much of the 20th century, the dominant explanation offered by historians leaned heavily on a framework sometimes called the Malthusian interpretation, named after the 18th century economist Thomas Malthus, who argued that populations tend to grow until they outstrip the food supply available to sustain them, at which point some kind of check famine, chief among them, brings numbers back into balance. Applied to the Great Famine, this view holds that 2 centuries of population growth and expansion onto marginal land had already pushed Northern Europe close to the very edge of what its agricultural system could support, so that even an ordinary run of bad weather, let alone 3 consecutive catastrophic seasons, was almost certain to trigger a crisis of this scale sooner or later. In this reading, the rain was less a cause in itself than a trigger, pulling a lever on a system that had already been quietly straining for generations. This interpretation held considerable influence for decades, and elements of it remain genuinely useful. But it has also faced sustained and thoughtful challenge from historians and increasingly from climate scientists working with tools that simply were not available to earlier generations of scholars. Researchers using tree ring analysis, ice core samples, and other forms of what is now called paleoclimatology have in more recent decades been able to reconstruct the weather patterns of this period with a level of precision that written chronicles alone could never provide. And what that evidence increasingly suggests is that the rainfall and cold of 1314 through 1316 was not simply an ordinary bad patch, striking an already overstretched system. It appears to have been a genuinely severe and unusual climatic anomaly in its own right, one that likely would have caused serious hardship even in a less densely settled, less marginally farmed Europe. This shift matters because it changes the moral and historical shape of the story in a meaningful way. If the famine is understood primarily as the inevitable consequence of medieval overpopulation, the emphasis falls on human decisions, generations of families settling land that perhaps should never have been farmed, an economic system that failed to build adequate reserves. If it is understood primarily as an extreme climatic event, the emphasis shifts toward forces genuinely beyond human control, an early savage edge of the broader cooling trend now recognized as the Little Ice Age arriving with a severity that even the most prudently managed agricultural society of the period would have struggled to fully absorb. The most careful current scholarship generally resists choosing definitively between these two positions, and this is worth sitting with, because it reflects something true and important about how good historical work actually operates. Rather than asking which single cause explains the famine, most serious historians today argue that the crisis emerged from the collision between the two, a population and agricultural system that had over 2 centuries gradually reduced its own margin for error, meeting a climatic event severe enough that it would likely have caused real hardship regardless, and devastating precisely because it struck a system with so little cushion left to absorb it. Scholars continue to debate the relative weight of each factor, and probably always will, since the surviving evidence, rich as it is in places, does not allow for the kind of precise, confident apportioning of blame between climate and human choice that a simpler story might prefer. There is a genuinely surprising twist within this broader climate research that deserves its own attention because it reframes something we touched on earlier in this story. Remember the earlier centuries of favourable growing conditions that allowed population and farmland to expand so dramatically before the crisis. Some recent climate historians argue that this earlier warm, stable stretch may itself have been part of what made the famine so devastating when it finally arrived, not simply by encouraging overexpansion onto marginal land, but by allowing an entire society to grow accustomed to a run of relatively predictable weather, unusually long even by medieval standards, so that when genuinely severe and erratic conditions finally returned, the shock landed on a population with less recent institutional memory of how to weather it than earlier harder generations might have carried. It is a striking thought that a period we might naturally think of as good fortune may have quietly set the stage for how badly the bad years that followed were ultimately felt. Historians also continue to debate the precise death toll, and it is worth being transparent about why a number that sounds on its surface like it should simply be countable remains so genuinely difficult to pin down with confidence. Medieval record-keeping, however impressive in certain respects, was never designed with future demographic reconstruction in mind. Parish registers recording births and deaths systematically do not yet exist in most of Europe during this period. What survives instead is a patchwork manor court records noting when a tenant's death triggered a change in land tenure, occasional civic burial accounts like the remarkable one preserved at Ypres, scattered chronicle references to mortality that are often impressionistic rather than precisely quantified. From this patchwork demographic, historians build careful estimates using statistical methods designed to extrapolate from partial data and different scholars. Working with different regional samples and different methodological assumptions arrive at figures that vary meaningfully generally, somewhere in the range of 5 to 12% mortality across the hardest hit regions. Though some specific localities appear to have suffered considerably more severely than that range would suggest, and others considerably less. What should we make of a range that wide when we are talking about human lives rather than abstract statistics? It is a fair question, and the honest answer historians give is that the range itself is part of the finding, not a failure of the research. It tells us the famine's severity was genuinely uneven, striking some communities with catastrophic force, while leaving neighbouring ones comparatively, if only comparatively less devastated, shaped by local factors like soil type, proximity to trade routes offering alternative food sources, the wealth and organisation of local charitable institutions, and simple unpredictable variation in exactly how severely the weather struck one specific valley or coastline compared with the next one over. There is one further scholarly debate worth addressing directly, precisely because it tends to be the detail people are most curious about, and because responsible history requires being just as careful with sensational claims as with mundane ones. As we discussed earlier, some contemporary chronicles include rumours of extreme desperation circulating during the famine's worst months. Modern historians have examined these claims with considerable scrutiny, tracing their origins where possible, and the general scholarly consensus is that these specific extreme accounts function primarily as reflections of genuine terror and rumour, characteristic of the period rather than as reliably documented, corroborated historical events. This is not historians being dismissive of real suffering. It is the opposite, an insistence on only asserting what the evidence genuinely supports, because the confirmed, well-documented reality of this famine, widespread death, profound social strain, land and livelihoods lost across an entire generation is already a fully sufficient and sobering picture without needing the embellishment that fear-driven rumour tends to add to any prolonged catastrophe. What emerges from all of this scholarly disagreement taken together is not a story any less certain in its broad outline, but one considerably richer and more honest than a single tidy narrative could ever be. The Great Famine was a genuine climatic catastrophe. It struck a society that had, through centuries of its own success, quietly narrowed its own margin for absorbing exactly this kind of shock. It killed through a complicated combination of hunger and disease that even contemporaries struggle to fully separate. And it left behind a body of evidence, chronicles, price records, court cases, burial accounts, and now skeletal remains, rich enough that historians are still 700 years later refining exactly how all of these threads fit together. Having sat with what the past can still tell us, and where honest scholarly uncertainty remains, there is a further question worth turning to. Now one that reaches beyond the famine's own 3 years and into what it left behind in the decades and generations that had to build themselves back on the ground the crisis had reshaped. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a landscape after a catastrophe finally lifts one that is different from the noise of crisis, and different too from ordinary peace, and it is worth spending some time inside that silence now, because it is where the Great Famine's true lasting shape becomes clearest. By the early 1320s, the acute crisis has passed. Harvests have returned to something closer to normal. Prices have eased back toward more familiar levels, and the desperate measures of the famine years, the sold land, the slaughtered breeding stock, the families scattered toward towns, have mostly settled into whatever new arrangement each affected household eventually found. But settling is not the same as healing, and the record left behind across the following decade shows a region working unevenly and often quietly through the accumulated weight of what those 3 years had actually cost. Land tenure across much of Flanders and rural England looks measurably different by the 1320s than it had before 1315. Small holdings that families had worked for generations sold off piece by piece during the worst months of the crisis do not simply return to their original owners once conditions improve. Monasteries and wealthier landholders who acquired that land during the famine largely retain it, meaning the crisis produced a genuine, lasting redistribution of rural property, concentrating a measurably larger share of farmland in fewer wealthier hands than had held it a generation earlier. Historians studying land records from this period describe this as one of the famine's quieter but most durable legacies, a structural shift in who actually owned the countryside achieved not through any single dramatic policy or conquest, but through 3 years of individually reasonable, desperately necessary household decisions, each one small, all of them together adding up to something genuinely significant. There is a demographic dimension to this recovery that deserves careful, honest framing precisely because it touches on a connection many popular retellings of this famine tend to overstate. It has become common in less careful accounts to describe the Great Famine as having directly weakened Europe's population just in time for the arrival of plague roughly 3 decades later, as though one crisis flowed neatly and inevitably into the next. The genuine picture that careful demographic and medical historians offer is considerably more measured than that. By the time plague reaches Europe in the late 1340s, an entire new generation has been born, raised and reached adulthood since the famine ended, meaning the specific individuals who suffered malnutrition during those 3 years are not simply the same population later struck by plague. What the more careful scholarship does support is something broader and less direct, that the earlier 14th century as a whole, including but not limited to the Great Famine, appears to have left European populations in several regions somewhat more vulnerable through a combination of factors including nutritional stress, elevated background, disease burden, and strained institutions heading it into a century that would prove exceptionally difficult by almost any measure. Scholars remain genuinely divided on how much weight to give the famine specifically, as opposed to other stresses of the period. In explaining the severity of what followed, and the most responsible position based on what survives in the evidence treats it as one significant thread within a larger, tangled 14th century tapestry rather than a single clean causal chain running directly from one catastrophe to the next. Why does this distinction actually matter beyond simple historical accuracy? It matters because the more careful version of this story is, if anything, more interesting than the simpler one, since it asks us to hold several genuinely difficult truths at once, rather than reaching for a single tidy line of cause and effect. It asks us to see the 14th century as a period shaped by multiple overlapping pressures, climatic, agricultural, demographic, and later epidemiological, none of them the sole author of what followed, all of them woven together in ways that even the most careful modern scholarship is still working to fully separate and weigh. What we can trace with real clarity and without needing to overstate any single causal link is how the famine reshaped the physical landscape itself in ways that remain visible even today. Some of the most marginal land settled during the earlier centuries of population growth, the flood-prone fields, the exposed hillside plots that had produced barely adequate harvests even in good years, were quietly abandoned in the aftermath of the famine and never resettled at the same density again. Landscape historians studying aerial surveys and soil records across parts of England and the Low Countries have identified patterns of settlement contraction dating to exactly this period: villages that shrink, field systems that simplify land, that reverts toward pasture or woodland after generations of cultivation. It is a rare thing to be able to look at a modern field boundary or an unusually wooded hillside and trace its shape back to a decision made in effect by a catastrophe 700 years gone, and yet in several documented cases across this region that is precisely what landscape archaeologists have been able to do. The famine also left a quieter mark on how governments and institutions began gradually to think about food security itself, though it would take centuries for this thinking to develop into anything resembling the systems we might recognize today. Several towns that experienced the crisis most severely maintained more substantial civic grain reserves in the decades that followed than they had kept before 1315. A direct, if modest and imperfect institutional response to the vivid, recent memory of what happened when those reserves proved insufficient. Historians studying municipal finance across the 14th century note this pattern with some consistency, though they're careful to point out that memory of this kind tends to fade across generations, and that many of these same towns would find their reserves tested again and sometimes again found wanting in later crises that this generation's careful planning could not fully anticipate. There is something worth sitting with in all of this about the strange layered way a single catastrophe continues to act on a society long after its most acute suffering has ended. It is there in who owns which fields a century later. It is there in the shape of a hillside that reverted to woodland and simply never went back to the plough. It is there more faintly and more indirectly than popular history sometimes suggests, in a broader 14th century already carrying more strain than any single crisis alone could fully explain. History examined this closely rarely offers the clean single-cause stories we might instinctively reach for. What it offers instead, if we are patient enough to sit with it, is something truer and in its own way more moving a genuine tangled human picture of how one difficult stretch of years can quietly, permanently reshape the ground an entire following generation has to stand on without that generation always fully understanding why. What remains now is to step back from land records and demographic tables entirely and simply sit for a while with what this story taken as a whole actually has to say. Not about Flanders in the 1300s specifically, but about the kind of world every one of us still quietly depends on whether we think about it or not. There is one more piece of evidence worth sitting with before we let this story rest, and it is smaller and stranger than almost anything we've looked at so far. In the archives of a Flemish monastery among the ordinary business of 13th and 14th century record-keeping, land transfers, debt settlements, the routine paperwork of institutional life, there survives a brief entry from the year 1317, noting the return of a small parcel of land to a family that had sold it 2 years earlier during the worst of the crisis. The entry is unremarkable in almost every way a document can be unremarkable. It does not explain why the land was returned. It does not name the individuals involved beyond what the legal transaction required. It simply records that the transfer happened filed away among hundreds of other equally dry entries, the kind of document a researcher might scroll past without a second glance, and yet sit with it for a moment and it becomes something quietly extraordinary. Somewhere in that gap between the lines, a family that had been forced to give up a piece of land they likely never expected to see again, land tied to generations of their own history, got it back. We do not know if the monastery simply returned it out of genuine compassion once the crisis had passed, and the family could finally repay what they owed. We do not know if some other arrangement, now lost entirely to us, made it possible. The record does not say, and after 700 years it likely never will. What the record does preserve in its own quiet administrative way is proof that recovery was not only a matter of harvest improving and prices easing. It was also, in at least this one small instance, an act of return of something broken being at least partially made whole again. This is in many ways the truest shape of the entire story we have spent these hours inside. Not a single dramatic turning point, but thousands of small, largely unrecorded moments like this one, scattered across an entire region. Each one representing a family, a household, a single human decision to keep going, to sell what had to be sold, to plant again the following spring, despite every reason not to trust the sky, to walk toward a town that might offer nothing, to hold on to a scrap of land or a single breeding animal for one more difficult season, in the quiet, stubborn hope that the worst had finally passed. We began this story with a woman kneeling beside an empty grain bin on a grey October afternoon doing arithmetic that would not come out right, no matter how many times she ran the numbers. We have spent the hours since then following the wider shape of what that private personal moment turned out to be, part of a catastrophe that reached from the humblest tenant farm all the way to the travelling household of a king that reshaped land ownership across an entire region, that left its trace not only in chronicles and court records, but in the very bones of the children who lived through it. It is worth remembering now that every piece of evidence we have examined, every price roll, every burial account, every Harris line found centuries later in an excavated skeleton, ultimately traces back to exactly that same kind of moment. Somebody somewhere running out of food and having to decide what to do next. What this history asks us to sit with more than any single fact or figure is how thin the line actually is between a functioning society and a devastated one. Northern Europe in the early 1300s was not a primitive or fragile world by the standards of its own time. It built cathedrals that still stand. It supported universities, complex trade networks, sophisticated systems of law and civic governance. And within the space of 2 bad growing seasons, some of the very same towns that raised those cathedrals were burying a measurable share of their own population, their governments improvising relief efforts with tools never designed for a crisis of this scale, their wealthiest and most powerful citizens discovering, some of them for the first time in their lives, that money alone cannot conjure grain that simply does not exist. That fragility is not a medieval peculiarity we have safely outgrown. It is a permanent feature of any society that depends, however invisibly, on systems working correctly, on rain falling roughly when and where it is supposed to, on harvests coming in close enough to expectation that the whole intricate structure of daily life can continue functioning without anyone having to think too hard about what holds it up. The families of Flanders in 1315 were not foolish or unprepared in any way that set them apart from us. They were living the same as we are inside a system that worked well enough for long enough that its own fragility had become almost invisible to the people depending on it. It took 3 years of relentless rain to make that fragility visible again, and by then the cost of seeing it clearly had already become severe. And yet, if fragility is one true thread running through this story, resilience is just as true a thread running alongside it, and it deserves equal weight in how we remember this crisis, not as a softening of the hardship, but as an equally honest part of the same record. The family that stretched bread with foraged roots for 3 consecutive years did not simply endure passively. They adapted meal by meal, season by season, finding ways to keep their household functioning that no one had taught them. And no chronicle bothered to record in detail because it was not to the people living it anything unusual. It was simply what survival required day after day for longer than anyone should reasonably have had to sustain it. There is something worth holding on to in that something that reaches well beyond this single famine in this single region in this single century. Civilizations are remembered more often than not for their monuments, their kings, their wars and their conquests, the visible dramatic architecture of power. But the actual substance of most of human history, the part that determined whether most people lived or died in any given year, was never really about kings or monuments at all. It was about grain in a bin, rain falling or failing to fall, a family deciding what to sell and what to keep, a monastery choosing whether to extend mercy or advantage to a desperate neighbour. That is where history actually happens in the overwhelming majority of human lives across the overwhelming majority of human history. The Great Famine simply happens to be one of the moments where that ordinarily invisible layer of existence became briefly and devastatingly visible enough for us to study it closely 7 centuries later and recognize something of ourselves in it. It is worth thinking too about memory itself and how strangely selective it can be. This famine killed, by the most careful estimates historians can construct, somewhere between 1 in 20 and 1 in 8 people across the regions hit hardest a toll that in scale rivals or exceeds all some of the more famous catastrophes that occupy far more space in popular historical memory. And yet it remains for most people a genuinely obscure event, overshadowed in public memory by the plague that would arrive a generation later, a crisis that killed with a drama and a speed that made it easier in some sense to remember and to mythologize. The Great Famine unfolded slowly instead 3 years, rather than a single terrifying season, its horror distributed across countless individual households rather than concentrated into the kind of singular vivid image that tends to survive in cultural memory. There is something worth sitting with in that too, the recognition that suffering does not need to be sudden or dramatic to be real, and that some of history's most significant catastrophes are also paradoxically among its quietest. Here in these final minutes, let the story settle. Picture the fields of Flanders again, not in crisis this time, but afterward. A few years on, the rain has become ordinary rain again, the kind that falls and passes and lets the sun back through. Somewhere in that landscape, a family works a small plot of land. Perhaps it is the same family we met at the very beginning, Perhaps it is another one, entirely one whose own grain bin ran empty in some other village nearby. It does not matter in the end which one it is. What matters is simpler than that. The wheat is growing again. It comes up green in the spring, the way it always had before, the way it always would after. Nobody watching it grow that particular year could have known with any certainty that the worst had genuinely passed. Memory of the failed years was still close, still raw in places, the kind of memory that makes a person watch the sky a little more carefully than they once did for the rest of their life. But the wheat grew anyway. Somewhere a bin that had once been scraped down to its bare wooden floor is slowly filling again one modest harvest at a time. Somewhere a piece of land once sold out of desperation has found its way back into the hands of the family that worked it for generations before and will work it for generations after. Somewhere a child born into the hardest years grows into an adult, who never speaks much about what those early years were actually like because there are no words readily available for it. Only a body that remembers quietly in ways even that person themselves may never fully understand. History does not usually resolve itself the way we might wish it to. There is no clean ending here. No moment where the ledger balances and the debt of those 3 years is fully repaid. The dead remain dead. The land redistributed during the crisis mostly stays redistributed. The fear that settled into an entire generation does not simply lift because the harvest finally came in, and still the wheat grows. That in the end may be the truest thing this story has to offer us, lying here now 700 years and an ocean away from a Flemish field in the rain. Not a lesson exactly, not a moral. Just an image patient and quiet of what people do again and again across every hard century history has ever recorded. They plant, even after everything. They plant and they wait, and sometimes the rain finally stops and sometimes it does not, and either way they plant again the following year, because that is what it means to be a person standing on this particular fragile, remarkable earth. Somewhere tonight, far from that old Flemish field, it is raining softly. The ordinary kind of rain, the kind that simply falls and passes, and somewhere quietly something is still growing.